The smell of sawdust never really leaves a workshop. It settles into the wood of the workbench, into the creases of your hands, into the fabric of whatever flannel shirt you happen to be wearing that day. After 41 years of building custom cabinetry, I stopped noticing it a long time ago. My wife, Ellen, used to say I smelled like a forest when I came in for dinner. She meant it as a compliment. Ellen meant most things as compliments. She passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to the last morning I held her hand in that hospital room. After that, the workshop became something different for me. It's less a place of business and more a place where I could still hear myself think without the silence of the house pressing in from all sides. I'm 67 years old. I retired from the business 2 years after Ellen died. Not because I had to, but because I'd built it to the point where my son-in-law could run it. Or so I believed at the time. My daughter is named Fiona. She's 34. She has her mother's eyes and, thankfully, her mother's instincts, though I wasn't so sure of that for a while. She met a man named Beckett 3 years ago at some rooftop fundraiser in the city. He worked in commercial real estate, wore suits that cost more than my first truck, spoke in the kind of measured, deliberate tone that people adopt when they've decided their words carry more weight than other people's. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. For Fiona's sake, for Ellen's memory, for the version of myself that still believed in extending good faith to people before they gave me reason not to. Beckett shook my hand the first time we met and looked past my shoulder while doing it. I noticed. I didn't say anything. People are nervous meeting a girlfriend's father. I gave him that. The second time, he made a comment about my truck in the driveway. A 2009 Ford F-150 with 142,000 miles on it. Reliable as a heartbeat, he said. And I remember this clearly, because I have a habit of filing things away, he said. That's a working man's truck. And he smiled when he said it. The way someone smiles when they've delivered a line they've been saving. I smiled back. I said, it is. The third time, he asked me, in front of Fiona, whether I'd ever considered doing something with the money Ellen and I had set aside over the years. Whether I'd spoken to a financial advisor, whether I knew what a diversified portfolio looked like. I was sitting at my own kitchen table when he asked me this. I had coffee in my hand. I looked at him for a long moment and then I said, I manage just fine, son. And I went back to my coffee. Fiona changed the subject. She was good at that. She'd learned it young, growing up between a father who said exactly what he thought and a mother who believed every room deserved peace. When Beckett proposed to Fiona, she called me first. That meant something to me. She was crying and happy and talking too fast. The way she always did when something mattered to her. I told her I loved her. I told her I'd loved her since the moment they put her in my arms in that delivery room, and that her happiness was the only thing I'd ever really worked toward. I meant every word. She asked me to help with the wedding. Not in a general, polite way. She asked specifically. She said, Daddy, I want this to be what you and Mom always imagined for me. Ellen and I had talked about Fiona's wedding since she was about 6 years old and had insisted on marrying her stuffed rabbit in a ceremony she organized herself, with the dog as the officiant. We'd laughed about it for decades. I told Fiona yes. I told her I'd cover it. Whatever she needed. What she needed turned out to be roughly $230,000 spread across a venue in the hill country, outside Austin. A caterer, a florist, a string quartet, a photographer, a videographer, hotel blocks for out-of-town guests, and about 15 other things I'm probably forgetting. I didn't flinch. Ellen and I had been careful with money our whole lives. Careful, not cheap. There's a difference. I had it. It was sitting in accounts I'd built over 4 decades of early mornings and late nights, and every job I took seriously, whether the client was a Fortune 500 company or a retired schoolteacher who wanted a new bookcase for her living room. I hired a wedding coordinator named Susan, competent woman, organized. She had a binder that I'm fairly certain contained the solution to world peace somewhere in its middle section. We booked the venue 14 months out. We put deposits on every vendor. Susan sent me weekly updates. I reviewed them at the kitchen table with coffee, the same way I review everything. What I did not do was insert myself into the planning beyond what Fiona asked of me. It was her wedding. I was the wallet and the father, and I was glad to be both. Beckett, for his part, barely participated. He showed up to the venue walkthrough 40 minutes late and spent most of it on his phone. He told Susan that the floral arrangements she'd proposed were a little country and asked whether they could get someone more elevated. Susan smiled the way professionals smile when they're being paid enough to absorb rudeness gracefully. I watched all of this and I kept my mouth shut. In the 8 months between the engagement and what would have been the wedding day, I saw Beckett 11 times. I counted later, because I'm the kind of man who counts. Out of those 11 times, he addressed me directly maybe 4. The rest of the time he spoke around me, past me, or at Fiona about things that didn't include me. He had a way of steering conversations away from anything that might give me an opening. I noticed something else, too. He never asked about Ellen. Not once. Most people, when they learn that a man's wife passed not long ago, find at least one moment to say something, to acknowledge it. Even to strangers at a party manage that. Beckett never did. I don't know if that was deliberate or just the shape of the man he was. Either way, it told me something. 7 weeks before the wedding, Fiona called me on a Tuesday evening. She sounded different, careful. She said that Beckett had been thinking about the guest list and wanted to make some adjustments. I said that was fine, guest lists shift. She said it was a little more than that. She said Beckett felt the wedding had grown too large and he wanted to make it more intimate, more curated. I asked her what curated meant in this context. She was as quiet for a moment. She said he wanted to focus on people who were relevant to their life going forward. I sat with that phrase. I turned it over in my head a few times. Then I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what that meant for my side of the family, for my brother and his wife, for my old business partner of 22 years, for the friends Ellen and I had kept for decades, people who'd known Fiona since she was in diapers. Fiona said she was still working it out with him. I said okay. I said I'd wait to hear more. And I hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. That was a Tuesday. On Thursday of that same week, Beckett called me himself. That was unusual. He almost never called me directly. He had the bright, professional voice he used in business, which I'd heard him switch into and out of enough times to recognize immediately. He said he appreciated everything I'd done for the wedding planning. He said Fiona was lucky to have a father who was so supportive. And then he said, and I want to be precise here, because these are the words I've turned over in my head more times than I can count. He said, we've decided we really want the celebration to be surrounded by people who are part of our world, our professional circle, our network, people who are relevant to where we're headed. I'm sure you understand that a man in your position might feel a little out of place among Fiona's and my social connections. No offense intended. It's really just about the energy we want in the room. A man in your position. I didn't say anything for a moment. I let the silence sit there between us on the line. Then I said, I understand completely, Beckett, and I told him I'd have to give some things some thought and I'd be in touch, and I hung up. I went to the workshop. I turned on the overhead light. I stood at my workbench, and I put both hands flat on the surface and I breathed. The smell of sawdust was everywhere, the way it always is. Ellen used to say I smelled like a forest. I thought about her. I thought about the 38 years we spent building something together, every bit of it from scratch, with nothing handed to us by anyone. I thought about Fiona at 6 years old, marrying her rabbit, the dog, looking confused in the corner. I thought about $230,000 I'd written checks for, deposit by deposit, because I wanted my daughter to have the wedding her mother had imagined for her. And then I thought about a man who had called me, in the politest possible terms, unimportant. I picked up my phone. I did not call Beckett. I did not call Fiona. I called Susan. Susan answered on the second ring. I told her there had been a significant change in plans and I needed her full attention for the next hour. She said, of course. That was a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Susan and I had worked through everything. She knew every vendor, every contract, every clause. I had co-signed most of them. The venue contract, in particular, was in my name entirely, because when we'd booked it, Beckett had been traveling, and I'd simply handled it myself. I called the venue first. I spoke to the event manager, a woman I'd met twice during walkthroughs. I explained that the event was being cancelled. She walked me through the cancellation terms. Because we were within 60 days, I forfeited the initial deposit, a number that stung, but that I absorbed without complaint. She was professional and kind about it. I thanked her. I called the caterer next, same conversation. Then the florist, then the string quartet. Their contractor was a little terse about it, and I understood that completely. Then the photographer, the videographer, the hotel block coordinator. Susan handled Miss Glan. Susan handled the linen rental company and the lighting designer, because by then it was late Friday afternoon and I had one more call I needed to make. I called my accountant. He's known me for 23 years. I explained that I needed to freeze the dedicated wedding account immediately and redirect the remaining funds. He asked no questions. He knew me well enough to know I don't do things without reason. He said he'd have it done by end of business. What remained in that account, after all the deposits and vendor payments made to date, was still substantial. More than I would have expected, honestly, because Susan had negotiated well, and several of the larger vendors hadn't yet processed their second installment requests. I slept well on Friday night, better than I had in weeks. Saturday morning, I was in the garden. Ellen had planted roses along the south fence line about 15 years ago, and I'd kept them going since she passed. It's the kind of work that asks you to pay attention without demanding anything from you emotionally. Pruning, checking for black spot, adjusting the stakes. I had my gloves on and I was working along the fence when I heard a car in the driveway. I didn't go around front. I kept working. After a minute or two, I heard the gate, and then Fiona came around the side of the house with Beckett behind her. She looked like she'd been crying. He looked like a man who had recently discovered that the floor beneath him was not as solid as he'd believed. I straightened up. I pulled off one glove. I looked at them both. Fiona said, "Dad," said, "Hey, sweetheart." Beckett said, "We need to talk about what you've done." I looked at him. I said, "All right." He said that he'd received calls from the venue, from the caterer, from multiple vendors. He said that what I had done was, in his words, an act of sabotage. He said I had torpedoed the wedding because my ego couldn't handle being excluded. He said he was going to consult a lawyer about whether I had any liability for their losses. I let him finish. He went on for a while. I've found that people like Beckett tend to when they're frightened and trying to cover it with volume. When he was done, I said, "Beckett, the contracts were in mine name. The accounts were mine. The deposits were drawn from funds I built over 40 years of work. Every vendor I called confirmed that I had the right to make the changes I made. So if you'd like to consult a lawyer, you're welcome to. I'd suggest you do it before you say anything else." He stared at me. I said, "You called me Thursday night and told me that a man in my position would feel out of place at my own daughter's wedding. You told me you wanted people who were relevant. I want you to understand something. I built a business from nothing. I put myself through night school while working full-time. I raised a daughter who is the finest person I know. I buried my wife with my hands and my savings and every piece of grace I had left. I am not a man who needs to justify his relevance to anyone, least of all to you." Beckett opened his mouth. Then he closed it. I looked at Fiona. She was very still. Her eyes were full. I said, "I love you more than anything in this world. And I would have written every one of those checks 100 times over for a wedding where I was welcome. But I will not fund a celebration that begins by telling me I don't belong there." She crossed the yard and she put her arms around me. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Neither did I. I could feel her shaking slightly the way she used to shake when she was small, and something had frightened her. Then she pulled back and looked at me and she said very quietly, "I didn't know he called you." I looked at her. I said, "I know." She turned around. She looked at Beckett for a long time, with the expression I recognized from her mother, the one that meant she had finished weighing something and had arrived at a conclusion that wasn't going to change. She said, "You called my father and told him he was irrelevant." Beckett said it wasn't like that. She said, "Don't." Just that one word. The way Ellen used to say it. She looked at the ring on her hand for a moment. Then she took it off. She set it on top of the fence post next to the roses. She said, "I need you to leave." He said her name. She said, "Please go." He stood there for another moment, recalculating, I imagine, figuring out whether there was a version of this conversation that ended differently. There wasn't. He turned and he walked back around the side of the house. We heard the car start. We heard it back out of the driveway, and then it was quiet, except for the sound of the neighborhood. A lawnmower somewhere a few streets over, a dog barking twice and then stopping. Fiona sat down on the garden bench Ellen had always used when she came out to tend the roses. She sat there for a while without talking. I sat down next to her. After a few minutes, she said, "I think I knew." "For a while," I said. "Most of us do. We just need a little time to catch up with what we already know." She leaned her head on my shoulder. We sat there in the morning sun, in Ellen's garden, among the roses Ellen had planted when Fiona was in high school, and our lives had felt very settled and very sure. I thought about what the next weeks would look like. There would be calls to make, guests to notify. Some of those conversations would be hard. Fiona would need time, and she would get it. She had always been stronger than she gave herself credit for, in the way that people who are genuinely kind sometimes mistake their own gentleness for weakness. The ring was still sitting on the fence post, a small expensive thing that had briefly held a future in it. I'd get rid of it eventually, or Fiona would. It didn't matter much. Pleat. What mattered was that my daughter was sitting beside me, that the roses were blooming along the south fence the way Ellen had always coaxed them to, that the morning was clear and the air was still cool, and we had time, real time, unscheduled and unhurried, that belonged to nobody but us. I don't know what Beckett told people about what happened. I don't particularly care. A man who measures other people's worth by their professional network will find, eventually, that the network has limits, and the measure was always wrong. That's not something I needed to say to him. It's something he'll figure out on his own, probably when he least expects it. What I know is this. My father worked a line job for 31 years and coached my little league team on Saturdays and never once made me feel like anything other than the most important person in whatever room we shared. I tried to do the same for Fiona. I don't know if I always got it right, but I know what I'm worth and I know what she's worth, and no man who couldn't see either of those things was ever going to build anything lasting with my daughter. She stayed for lunch that day. We made sandwiches. We talked about her mother a little, the way we sometimes do when it's just the two of us. And the day is quiet enough for it. We talked about what came next, not in a heavy way, just in the way of people who have gotten through something and are beginning to look forward again. When she left that afternoon, she hugged me at the door for a long time. Then she held me by the shoulders and looked at me the way Ellen used to, like she was checking to make sure I was all there, and she said, "I love you, Dad. I'm sorry it took me this long." I told her there was nothing to be sorry for. I told her she'd seen it when she needed to, and that was enough. I told her she was her mother's daughter, which is the finest thing I know how to say about anyone. I watched her car until it turned the corner. Then I went back to the workshop. I turned on the overhead light. I stood at the bench with my hands flat on the surface, the sawdust smell all around me, and I thought about Ellen and about Fiona and about the kind of quiet that isn't empty, the kind that's full of everything that matters and nothing that doesn't. Some things are worth more than any wedding. That's not a lesson I had to learn. It's one I've known since the morning I first held my daughter and understood, without anyone telling me, that everything I did from that point forward would be for her. I still know it. I'll know it until I don't know anything at all.